A really, really warm welcome and thank you very much to Dr. Bryan Mills and his business course final third year students. One of our aims as a company, as Headtalks, we're an outsourced software development company, but one of our key aims really over the next 5 years is to engage with the college and with other educational institutions as much as possible. And one of the aims of today, from our own internal perspective, is it's all about learning, it's all about sharing knowledge, and it's all about thought leadership. It's about trying to work out what's the next thing that we need to be doing, how do we continually improve. And the idea of actually bringing yourselves as students into this is to hopefully give you an insight into what's next, what's the next knowledge that we are all consuming ourselves. The modern workplace is a continuous learning process, and obviously, this kind of educational we call it an internal educational process, but it's really important for everyone here that we try and keep on top and stay ahead of the game, really. So today I'd like to introduce Dave Longman. I think most of the people from Headtalks have probably met Dave. We'll be talking about distance learning. Dave's background, actually, before he worked at Headtalks, actually worked in a company that had to go through a lot of change, deal with the challenges of distance and that geographical distance. We all have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis, but actually have to overcome that is what Dave's going to be talking about. So I'm not going to say any more, but over to you, Dave, thanks.
Thanks, Toby. Right, so, like Toby said, I'm Dave Longman. I'm a developer turned project manager. So, for the last 10 years or so, I've been managing projects with software teams. For the last probably 6 years, I've been in a number of different roles, the product owner or a scrum master, working within Agile teams. And almost all of the teams that I've worked with have had some element of distribution with them. So that's either completely distributed teams or teams where just 1 or 2 people have been working in a different location. So today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the challenges that those teams had, challenges that you have with communication generally, especially when you're distributed. I'm going to walk through a few examples of teams that I've worked with. I'm going to talk about the key challenges that each of those teams had. I'm going to talk about things that we did to try and alleviate some of these challenges and tell you whether they worked or not. And then I'm going to finish up with a few recommendations. So if you're looking to work remotely with somebody, some recommendations of things that you can try to help make that process more streamlined. Okay, so let's start with communication. Humans are naturally social creatures, and we rely a lot on face-to-face communication to build relationships with people and to understand how people work. When you build a strong relationship with somebody, it really makes communication much, much easier. With strong relationships, people are able to deal with poor communication much more easily. So if you have a great relationship with somebody, a close relationship, you can sometimes not even notice that you're having a poor type of communication with them. So quite often you can, like people like your mum, you can speak to your mum on the phone very infrequently, and you can have kind of low fidelity communication, but you don't really notice that as much because you've built up a strong relationship with your mum over a course of the years. But if it's somebody you've only just met, it's much more difficult to build up a meaningful communication relationship with somebody you don't really ever see. So this is, I think, why pen pals never really took off, because you were only ever communicating over a slow, paper-based communication. So communication is very important to build this relationship. So when you have people who are remote to you, it makes this process much more complicated to develop. So I'm going to give you a few examples of why remoteness makes this more complicated. So if you look at a team, a co-located team, there's 7 people there, and you look at the external relationships that those people need to manage. So when you're all co-located, you've got 7 people together, there's really no external relationships that you need to worry about. I'm going to say there's one. There's one if you're an individual and you need to communicate with the team as a whole, rather than an entity. So we're going to say as a baseline, a co-located team has got an external relationship count of 1. So let's look at what happens when you move one of those people out to a remote location. So at this point, if you're looking at external relationships again, you've got the external person has to build and develop 6 external relationships with each of the people who are co-located in the office. And each of those people themselves have to have an external relationship back to this remote person. And the remote person still has this external relationship back to the main team. So just by moving one person from a co-located team out to a remote location, you've gone from 1 external relationship up to 13. So even if we're talking about distributed relationships taking up a little bit more effort than face-to-face relationship building, you've made quite a big difference here just by moving one person remotely to the communication layer within your team as a whole. If we look at how this extrapolates out, the more remoteness you have in your team. In this example, we've got 2 split teams. So if we look at one of the people as an example for each of them, so you've got team 1. Each person in team 1 has to develop 3 external relationships with the people in team 2. And they need to have that communication back. They also have to have communication from their team to team 2 as a whole. And then the same is the case the other way. So team 2, everyone there has to have 4 external relationships to the people in team 1 and to the team as a whole. And then there's also, because you've now got 2 teams that need to communicate together as an entity, then you've got team 1 versus team 2 communications to manage as well. So in this example, you've gone up to 33 layers of external relationships that need to be managed. The final example, you've now got a fully distributed team. So in this example, you've still got the same size team, but everyone is in a different location. So the same logic here, everyone has to build up these external relationships, but the number goes up to 49. So by having a team that's co-located with 1 external relationship count, you've now gone to 49 external relationship counts just by making everyone remote. So this is a pretty significant increase in the complexity of the communication layers you have in your team as a whole. So this is why it's important to have teams communicating well and looking at ways to minimise the challenge of this external communication. But it's not just about the fact that these people are distributed in different locations. We look at a few other things. So if you look at time zones, so what tends to happen if you have a distributed team, you tend to find that 1 or more of the people in your team are working in a different time zone to other people in your team. Obviously this never happens in a co-located team because you're all by definition in the same time zone. But the challenge with having different time zones is it decreases the amount of overlap of your working day. So if you're working with a team that is 5 hours different time zone to where somebody else is, then in an 8-hour working day, you've only got a few hours of overlap where you can build any of this communication and build these relationships with people in your team. So you're decreasing the amount of time that is available to build a relationship. And we've already seen previously, just by having people in different locations, that building those relationships is more complicated and takes more effort. So by having different time zones, you make this more complex again. But this same scenario isn't just about time zones. So if you look at a current trend at the moment is for an increase in the amount of home working. So people often work some or all of their time from home, and one of the reasons to do that is that it allows you to be much more flexible about when you work in the day. So you can maybe start much earlier and finish early, so you can pick children up from school, or start later, or you might have an early start and you work for a few hours and have a gap in the middle of the day, and then then work again later in the evening, so you kind of split your day. So this has a slight advantage sometimes in that it can minimise some of the time zone differences, especially if you're doing a split day. So you can have more overlap with people working in different time zones. But more often what happens is what you've done by having this kind of shifted working day is you've created an artificial time zone between people in your team. So even if they might all be based in the UK, if somebody's starting work at 6 o'clock in the morning and finishing at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that's the same as them working in a 3-hour different time zone. So you're kind of creating an artificial time zone. So time zones and difference in overlap of working time is another factor that it builds on the complexity and the effort it takes to build relationships with people in your team. The final one I'll talk about is cultural differences. So what you often find with distributed teams is one of the reasons for distributing is that you can move some of that work to a different country. And then when you move to a different country, what you then find is English is often not the first language of some of the people in your team. So this adds another layer of complexity onto communicating with people. So if somebody is communicating with you in a language that's not their mother tongue, then some of the nuances of communication is lost. So it makes it more difficult to understand what people are saying and to really carry on kind of building a relationship that's based on kind of no misunderstandings. Now, obviously this is quite, I think everyone can kind of understand what this is like when it's a completely different language. So you've got someone who speaks French and someone who speaks English, so there's a different language. But this also happens between people who speak the same language. So as an example, I did a training course a few years ago in America, and I was in the middle. I had a training course with about 20 people, and we were walking through how a piece of software worked. And I pointed up on the screen, I explained how to do something. I said, "Oh, you just need to tick the tick box to do this." And I looked up at the room, and the whole room looked at me completely blankly, like I'd said something that just made no sense whatsoever. And it took a while, and then we realised that after I pointed out where it was on the screen, that the thing on the UI that I was talking about was a checkbox, and the people in the audience didn't have any concept of what I was talking about when I called it a tick. They don't understand what a tick. They didn't understand what a tick was in that context. So for me, that was a moment. Okay, right. So fine, we'll call it a check. It's a checkbox. You can check a checkbox. So there are lots of small things like that that hamper communication, even between people who fundamentally speak pretty much the same language. The other challenge you have with cultural differences is around different, not just language, but different cultural things they do. So there can be different religious implications of working time. There can be things like periods of time when people fast in certain religions. So that is another layer that adds complexity onto the dynamics between your team. Another thing that happens between countries is you have different working times, so holidays, annual holiday. So there are countries where you don't work over there are countries like ours where we don't tend to work over Christmas, but other countries work over Christmas. So then you have a mismatch in the working day. And this is a very similar problem to have with a time zone change. albeit a slightly less common occurrence. So I think overall for communication, given this is such an important factor in building relationships with people, the more distribution we have in our teams, the more effort it takes for all the individuals in that team to communicate with each other and to build this good working relationship with each other. So that's some kind of things just to be aware of when we're talking about external distributed teams. So let's look a bit about, let's go through a few examples of teams just to give you an idea of how these different teams look and some of the challenges that the different structures of teams have. So I'm going to start with a fairly easy example. So in this example, we've got a team of people and they're all co-located in the same office. So they're all sitting in the same office, and we've got a team of developers, a team of testers, and a product owner. So in this example, we're just moving from a more traditional team setup where we had development teams and testing teams and product owners and project managers to an agile structure where we were trying to create cross-functional teams to work on product lines. So what we did in this case, we picked some developers from the development team, we picked some testers from the testing team, and we merged them together into a product team. It's a fairly standard approach for creating a team. One thing we did, we left everyone sitting where they were in the office. It's just another project. There's no need to cause loads of disruption by moving people around. And this worked okay for a while. The agile kind of practices that we were following, so daily stand-ups, and we had a Kanban board on a whiteboard, which was in the office, so everyone could see what they were doing. This improved our communication, and everything was working okay. But when we actually looked a little bit more deeply at what was happening, what we found was the testing team were still working completely independently of the development team. So we'd have a planning session, and the developers and testers would be together, and we would talk through what we were delivering, and then the developers would go off and they would start building the thing they're building. And when they thought it was finished, they would hand it over to the testing team, and the testers would start testing, and they would find issues, and they would fill in a defect report in our defect system, and that would get electronically sent over to the developer. The developer would look at it, and there would be a lot of discussion back and forward over this electronic means for why can't we reproduce this issue? Are you sure it's really a problem? Those kind of conversations, and these conversations were happening electronically over an office where we had the developers sitting maybe 50 metres away from the testers. So we wanted to improve the communication between the developers and the testers. We wanted to have the developers understand more about what the testers were going to be doing, and use that to help them deliver better quality code. And we wanted to reduce the amount of overhead that was being spent by filling in defect reports and getting them sent around the organisation. So what we did in this example was we physically moved people around in the office. So we moved the developers and moved the testers, so they sat together in the same area in the office. And we moved the board around and everything. And almost straight away, we found that there was more ad hoc conversation between the developers and the testers. So there was a much more conversation about the testing. We started to see less of a dependency on logging defects and in the defect tracking system. There was a little bit more talking. And we did this for about 3 months. And while the initial move of people did have an impact on improving and increasing the amount of verbal communication that happened between the teams, we found there was still a little bit too much of a them and us testing versus development. We would, developers would still develop things and kind of just hand it over to testing at the last minute. And we looked at why this was. And what we found when we looked at what we had done when we moved the people together to sit together, we kind of moved them as a block. So we moved the developers and they sat in one row of desks. And then the other side of a partition between their desks was the testing team. So we'd moved them so they were kind of next to each other, but there was still basically a physical wall with this partition between the developers and the testers. So we had another desk move and we mixed everybody up. So we had developers and testers sitting next to each other. And this, after a small teething challenge of having, there was a little bit of discontent with developers and testers sitting next to each other. They all felt it was a bit weird to start off with, but that soon disappeared. And we found what was happening then was the developers and testers would naturally be sitting down and looking at the same screen in a lot of cases and talking through what tests the tester was running, and the developers were talking to the tester as they were talking about defects. Okay, well, I'm not sure how I can't reproduce that on my screen. Look at this, and they were having conversations straight away about being able to try to identify why this issue was happening on one system but not another system. We also found that the developers started to get a better understanding of what it was the testers were actually trying to do with software. What tests were actually going to be run on software before they said, actually, I think this is done. So we found there was a lot more, a lot higher quality developer testing going on before anyone said that this is ready for testing. So in this example, we kind of moved a distributed team within the same office to make them sit next to each other. Now, the reason this is an example is when we talk about distributed teams, we almost always initially think of a team where there's some country difference or time zone difference or some significant difference in geography between the remote teams. To bear in mind here is that even a small amount of difference in the same office can have really significant impact on the communication, the way the teams work together. Okay, so the second example. This is a more traditional distributed, geographically distributed example. So we've got a team of developers and testers all in one office. And then we've got a product owner who is in a different office. And there, in this example, we had developers in the UK and a product owner in the US. We had a bit of a time zone difference. Now, the challenge we had in this example was getting time available with the product owner for the co-located team to be asking small questions. So the big kind of planning conversations we could handle, that wasn't too bad. You just schedule a meeting, we could have a planning meeting. It was the day-to-day, really minor discussions that happened. So actually, I'm not really sure. Do you think it would be better if the this button was on this side of the screen or this side of the screen? Or do you think it would be better looking like this or like this? Or actually, I'm not really sure, now we started writing this bit of functionality, exactly what we agreed when we said the user needs to be able to do this. So it was these really small conversations that happen when you're in the same office, they happen kind of all the time. You push your chair back and speak to the person sitting behind you, and you can get that answered really quickly. What we found in this example was those questions never really got asked because it was just a bit too much hassle to find a time when the product owner was available. So we ended up having a, let's say, quality issue, where we would get things finished with and show them to the product owner at the end, and it wasn't quite what they wanted. It was basically what they wanted, but there were a few little things that we could have easily dealt with while we were building the application. So what we did in this example was we created a deputy product owner. So this is possibly a slightly kind of controversial Agile approach, but we created a person in the co-located team whose job it was to be the voice of the product owner with the development team all the time. They were there all the time. They were responsible for doing most of the maintenance work on the backlog, the product backlog. So they made sure that the product backlog was in sufficient detail for the team to be working on. They understood what the product owner was trying to achieve, and they could answer a lot of the questions that the development team had day to day. Obviously, they couldn't answer everything, so their role was to escalate things they didn't know about back to the product manager, and they still had an external relationship to manage with the product owner. But scheduling a meeting with one person and a remote person is a much easier challenge to solve than having 6 people all trying to communicate with one person. So we had this kind of product owner deputy who came in, and they made sure they had regular communication with the real product owner, if you like, to make sure that what we were delivering was aligned with the longer term goal of the product we were designing. So what we ended up with the remote product owner becoming a bit more kind of long-term strategy led, and then the product owner deputy being much more tactical day-to-day changes and making sure that the work the team was doing here was really aligned with what the product owner was looking at. So we resolved this issue by having a deputy. The other kind of secondary challenge we had with this example was sometimes the product owner wasn't available when we wanted to do the end of sprint kind of demo. For some reason, the product owner was somewhere else and they weren't able to make it. So what we started doing was recording our demo meetings. So we would, this was slightly weird to start off with because you had a co-located team in an office presenting to a screen to themselves as if there's another person listening, but there was no other person listening. We were just presenting and recording. Now, a lot of times the product owner was there, so that wasn't quite something, but there were a few cases where they weren't there. So we recorded this demo meeting, and that gave the product owner then a chance to watch the video and watch the demo asynchronously to the main team, and then they could follow back either with one of the team directly if it was a really specific question they had, or they could follow up with the product owner just to make sure that things were aligned and then pull that back into a future sprint. So that seemed to work reasonably well. Now at this point, I'm a bit conscious that I've given you 2 examples of distributed teams, and in both of those examples, my solution, or our solution, was let's get rid of the distribution and bring everyone together. Now, that's not always possible. So I've got another example where we didn't do that. So in this example, looks very similar to the last one in this picture, but so we've got a co-located team and we've got a single remote person. Now in this case, the remote person was a tester. So we had a product owner and some developers and tester co-located, and we had a remote tester. So the challenge we were trying to address here was how do we enable the remote tester to take part in all of the same types of ad hoc conversations that happen when you're co-located when they're thousands of miles away. So the solution we had before was to record things and allow that communication to happen more asynchronously. That's not really going to happen. That's not really going to work quite so well when you've got a tester who's working very closely with the developer all the time. So the solution we had in this example was to move away from physical Kanban boards and face-to-face conversation and move to an electronic Kanban board, and we started to use Skype for our dev-test communication a lot more. So what this allowed, what we found when we started to use Skype within the team was that instant messaging, text-based communication was a really great way of being able to replicate as much as you can the pushing your chair back in the office and tapping someone on the shoulder. Can you just have a quick look at this? You could Skype someone and say, "Oh, have you fixed defects 1, 2, 3? Is it ready for me to look at?" Or have we deployed release 12 to the testing environment? Those sort of conversations are things that you can have a really quick yes/no sort of answer. So we found that was a reasonable way of communicating back and forth with this remote person. The other nice thing we found with Skype was it's very easy when you get this question come in and it turns out it's not a yes/no quick answer. You can quite quickly elevate that communication from a text-based communication into a voice communication just by clicking a button and somebody's there and you can speak to them. So we found this was a good way of having dev to test kind of ad hoc conversations. Clearly not as good as speaking to someone in the same office, but it was not a bad proxy for us. The other thing we had, we did this tester came over to this office probably once every quarter. They came over for a couple of weeks. And they didn't come over for anything specific. They just came over and worked with the team as if they were just doing normal work. So we have no fixed agenda for them to come over. They just came over and worked with the team for a couple of weeks. And while they're over, we could bolster some of the relationships that we had built over time with face-to-face communication. And we found that regular ability to augment the relationship building with face-to-face communication was enough time to give the relationship strength that they survived this remote communication over the next quarter. So every time you're having a remote conversation, you're kind of slightly chipping away at the value of your relationship. So by kind of bringing people over and having a face-to-face communication again, then you kind of rebuild your power bar again, and then you can leave it to kind of almost drop down again later. So we started doing that. We also, so one of the things that we tried that didn't work particularly well was planning meetings. So we had planning meetings and we included the remote person, we had a remote meeting. And we all tried very hard to continue to remember that there's a remote person, another person in this call. But what we found was this meeting, where the majority of the people are all in the same room, quite often got pulled into a rabbit hole of conversation. And it wasn't for quite a long time in that meeting that you'd suddenly go, "Oh, sorry, we forgot that you were on the other end of the phone." And it was always hard to get a really clear input from the remote person in those meetings. That's not something that we actually managed to really resolve. We kind of kept persevering. And everyone in the team, all the retrospectives, we were saying, yeah, we really need to include Laurie in these conversations more and pay more attention. Everyone kind of, yeah, we're definitely going to do that. And then in those meetings, we would all start off trying to do that with the best intentions, and then we'd find ourselves having an in-depth conversation where we'd forgotten that this person was on the other end of the phone. So some things work well here, some things were less successful. So my last example is an example where we've got a split team. So this example, we've got developers and testers in one office, and we've got developers and product owners in another office. So the challenge we were trying to address here was there was a significant technology experience difference between these two teams. So we had one team had a lot of experience in one layer of the application and very little in another. And we had the other team, and they had a lot of experience in the other area of the application, but not so much in the other. Not sure. So what we wanted to do was cross-pollinate the knowledge between the two teams. So what we started doing in this example, we set up a generally monthly face-to-face visit for at least one of the people in one of the teams to go to the other office. So that allowed us to have a fairly regular cycle where somebody in the team was starting to build some relationships with at least one of the people in the remote team. We also, at the start of each kind of core piece of work, got everyone together in the same place to allow them to start talking about what it is we're going to be building for the next few months. So we had a shared understanding of what we were doing for the next quarter or 6 months. And then we found that started to build a reasonable team's bond around the team, and then with the regular face-to-face visit for somebody, then that kind of added to build that up. So then the second thing we started doing was doing pair development a lot more. So we explicitly started by pairing people from different offices. So we would have remote pairs all the time. So that allowed us to start to migrate some of the knowledge from each of the remote people. So you started to get a bit more of a shared understanding of what it is that those teams are trying to do. We also did some, in one of the face-to-face, we did some mob programming to start getting everyone understanding a little bit more about where everyone's skill sets were. So, oh, this person's really strong in this area, but weaker in this bit, so we understand that when we have the next lot of pairing and work, we can start to try and meld those two skills together, so we start to get a much better broad spectrum of knowledge between the two different groups of people. A second thing that we were concerned about here was we had a fairly low test to dev ratio. So we wanted to work out how we were going to get the value of a tester, or what's the best value of a tester? What can they be doing that is providing the best value when there's a lot more developers than there are testers? So what we started to do here was focus the testers on paying a lot of attention to exploratory testing and trying to break the application, and talking through the test scenarios that they think are important with the developers before we start writing too much of the application. So, so at that point then the developers know kind of how their homework's going to be marked before they started writing it. So you want everyone to know what good looks like. So we'd have the developers knowing what the test scenarios are going to be before they start writing too much of the code. And then we focus on doing a lot of automated testing. And once you've got the test scenarios defined, you can have almost anyone in the team implement the tests. So we have the developers, in this case, implementing all the automated acceptance tests, which worked very well because the tester then is spending time defining what the important scenarios are. And once you know what the important scenarios are, there's no kind of conflict of interest really of the developers writing the tests, because then they're just implementing some logic that is exercising some of the spec that's already been kind of designed by an independent person. And one of the things we found here was it started to get a lot better communication between developers and testers. We can start talking about the test scenarios as a team thing rather than as a separate dev versus test kind of conversation. Okay, so that's 4 examples of different types of team structure and some of the challenges that each of those different teams had and what we did about them. So I want to talk a little bit now about some general recommendations. So if you're going to set up a team and it's got some sort of remoteness to it, then some things that you can kind of think about. So we'll start with instant messaging. I'm sure everyone here is used to using Skype or some instant messaging competitor, but just in case you're not, instant messaging we found was a super valuable tool. It was a really good proxy to the chit chat in the office. So if you're not using an instant messaging client of some sort, then that's something that you need to start. I think you should start looking at. If you're not using Skype, then something for Teams, one of the persistent chat tools like a Slack or a HipChat is probably a slightly better product to start looking at. The value of the persistent chat applications is that they become a much better resource for the whole team, a project resource. So you find that more and more of the kind of conversations that happen over and over again then can be things that get recorded and kept inside the chat application, and the searching and allows you to find them much easier than the alternative, which is often just to email out to a group of people, oh, this is how you configure the VPN client. That then, when new people come into the team, they haven't been included on those emails, so they don't get the knowledge of that. So persistent chat was quite useful for that. If you're not using that, so group messaging in Skype is an alright proxy for some of that. The only problem that we found with group conversations in Skype is you constantly get alerted to messages. It becomes overwhelming sometimes how many notifications of messages come up. And if you're using instant messaging for a team conversation, a lot of the time you actually don't care about a lot of those messages. You only really want to know when somebody really wants to speak to you and not just somebody in the team. So Skype, one of the things I found out when I started Head Forwards was there's a hidden subculture of geeky commands in Skype. So it will start with a weird slash and then there's some word after it. And one of them is you can switch off alerts for a group message. It's just been a complete revelation to me. You can switch off alerts and it doesn't pop up when it's normally posted all the time. But then when you go into the application, oh, there's 127 unread messages in this group conversation. Oh, brilliant. It's not as it was read. I'll move on. So, instant messaging, I think that's the first thing. Second thing, meetings. So, remote meetings and face-to-face meetings aren't really that different. All the things that make a face-to-face meeting work well are all the same things that a remote meeting needs to work well. I think the real difference between a remote meeting and a face-to-face meeting is there's a lot more, you need to put a lot more emphasis on the good meeting practice, so good facilitation and not speaking over people, allowing everyone to take part in the conversation, prompting people for input, sticking to an agenda, staying on time. All those things are just good meeting etiquette. Become much more important when you've got a remote team. It's really easy when you've got somebody on the other end of the phone to find yourself having a side conversation in one of the rooms where the other people in the meeting can't actually hear anything you're saying apart from just a bit of noise in the background that make it really hard to follow anything else that's happening. So just keeping track of good meeting etiquette is really important with a remote meeting. So at the start I talked about how humans look at non-verbal communication, non-verbal cues as a core part of communicating. When you're on a remote meeting, you don't have any of these non-verbal cues. So one of the things that, one of the solutions that's quite often suggested as a way of resolving this is to add video to your remote meetings. I've always found video in meetings a bit of a double-edged sword. If you can get really good video in your meetings, then it does help. It does make it easier. You can see the big changes when people communicate. So you can see arm waving and big frowns and kind of shaking heads and irritation. You can't really see really subtle things very easily. So it's still not as good as having people there, but it does really help. However, if you don't get really good video, and you have mediocre video, or you have stuttery video, or you have really low res video, that's a massive distraction to the meeting, and it's probably more harmful for your meeting and how well your meeting goes than to not bother having video at all. So I think if you can get good video, go with it. If you can't get good video, or you sometimes get good video and sometimes don't, then don't bother about video at all, just scrap it completely. The other thing that's a big distraction in remote meetings is the fiddling around at the start and setting stuff up. So if the number of times I've sat in a meeting where you spend the first 10 minutes just making sure that everyone can actually hear what's going on, or you can hear and you can project video and you can share screens all at the same time. I think the number of times I've done that is probably feels like infinite. And what you find, apart from that just being a total waste of time and money at the start of the meeting, it also just starts the meeting off in a really bad kind of footing. You end up, then it's much more difficult to keep to an agenda and keep on time and follow all the ground rules of the meeting. You've already started off really badly, and it kind of then just stumbles into carrying on with the bad meeting. So remote meeting, I think the number one thing is to focus on just having really easy setup of your remote meeting. Physical things you can do. So one of the things I talked about right at the start was if moving people, you've got to be careful of even slightly remoteness in a team has a really negative impact on how well a team communicates. So if you can move people so they are all together, then do that. However, obviously in a lot of cases, you're not going to move somebody 1,000 miles or 5,000 miles just because it's a bit awkward to talk to them face to face. So, if you're going to have a remote team, you need to make sure that you've still got time to have face-to-face meetings with people, like real in-person meetings. One of the things that's nice to do, if you can, is rotate the travelling hassle around with the teams. It's not always the same person travelling all the time. Now, that's obviously quite a difficult thing to do if you've got one remote person and everybody else is remote. It kind of makes sense then for the remote person to be the person who travels. But if you've got a team where it's a much more even split, then sharing the travelling love around to everyone makes it less of an onerous thing to do. There's also a few things you can do to help build good team spirit that isn't actually work or project related. So try to do stuff that is not work related, that you can involve everyone in your team with. So we've done remote hackathons where it's been something with nothing to do with the work we're doing, just some project that somebody fancied doing. We had 2 days to do it, and we can involve people from different different locations. We've also done lunchtime Xbox competitions and fantasy football competitions, which is always good fun when you had the US versus the UK. That was always fun when you started talking about fantasy football. Turns out it's all completely different over there. But these kind of non-work related things all really help to bring a team together and have that strong bond between individuals in the team. So last recommendations around coding. So technical people quite like talking to other technical people about technical stuff quite a lot of the time. If you can get developers especially to pair program or more multi-programs with people, that's a good way of encouraging communication between the technical people in your team. It is harder to do this remotely. Remote pairing is much more tiring and it's much less productive immediately than doing it face to face. But it is possible to do with a little bit of time and effort. You can use just a Skype screen sharing session to do remote pair programming, and that works okay. There are some tools that, like I think there's one called Screen Hero that is designed to do remote pair programming. It's not something that I've got any experience with other than I'm still getting clicked around with it. But Skype seems to work okay for that. One of the challenges we found with doing it for Skype screen sharing sessions for pair programming is when the pairs have got completely different screen sizes. You find that one of the people has to either squint on a tiny screen or scroll around this window all the time to actually see where the code is. So it's something that's a very useful way of sharing technical knowledge between different people within your team. And it is possible to do remotely. Something you should try to do. So that's my kind of key recommendations. So just to summarise, communication is a really integral part of building a good team. It's very easy to forget that even a few metres of separation has some of the same impact of that I've been talking about as thousands of miles. Now there is tooling available that can help minimise some of the impact of this distribution, but none of it really completely replaces the need for face-to-face communication time. So you need to spend time making sure people have got a chance to meet with each other. And with a little bit of time and a little bit of effort from everyone in your team, you can stop remoteness being a disabler to your teams. And you can have high-performing teams even if they are separated by thousands of miles. That's me done.